My name is Ray Vaughn, and I live in Edmond, Oklahoma. I was at WKY-TV from 1973 to 1976, but I had a little bit of prehistory with Channel 4 in that when I was still a student at Oklahoma Christian University, I decided about my sophomore year that I would like to try a career in broadcasting. And I didn't know anything about it, of course, so Channel 4 was the biggest and best and everything station in Oklahoma at that time, so I thought they'll know the answer down there, and that's where I'd like to work. So I went down one day and just walked in the front door, walked up to the receptionist there, and I said, I'd like to go to work here at Channel 4. And the lady, God love her, called Chris Daniels. And Chris came down to the lobby, spent, 15, 20 minutes visiting with me, was very kind, and said, son, if you want to go to work at Channel 4, he says, I can put you to work today, pushing a camera or something, but if you really want to be on the news or do something on the air, you'll need to go to a radio station and spend about a couple of years preparing to come back. And he says, if you'll do that and come back and see me in 2 years, then I'll give you a job. I'll make sure you find something to do. And so I took that advice, and I went back to Edmond. There was a little station there called KWHP, owned by Bill Payne. And I told Bill that I wanted to try to work there, and Bill was glad to do it because I was cheap at the time and willing to work for the experience. And so I worked there for a couple of years, and then as I was a senior at Oklahoma Christian, I went back to WKY, and true to their word, they found me a job working in the radio station. So I was the weekend morning man in the news department at WKY Radio for at least that next year until I graduated. When I was hired at WKY Radio, Lee Allen Smith was the general manager of the radio station. Norm Bagwell, of course, was the general manager of the entire station, but Lee Allen was managing the radio station. Ed Hardy, an old ABC war correspondent, was the news director. And I was primarily trained by a fellow by the name of Jerry Fontaine, who was an excellent radio newsman. And I thoroughly loved the work on the radio station because I got to work with all the DJs on the weekends, and it was typically just myself and one of them. And I worked, of course, with Don Wallace and Danny Williams and Ronnie Kay and Freddie Hendrickson and all those great DJs that everyone's known for so long. But that led me kind of wanting to go downstairs to the television section. And from time to time, they'd let the radio guys kind of do the news insert for Russell Pearson in the Morning Farm show. And I did that a few times, and of course that just whetted my appetite. Well, I spent a lot of time down in the news section, and Ernie Schultz encouraged me to do that. And I would go out with Daryl Barton or Oliver Murray, and we'd go out on stories, and I would just kind of watch and tag along. And once I graduated from college, they encouraged me to perhaps go find a job in a small TV market, and someday they might call me to come back. And so I went to K10 down in Ada, Oklahoma, got a job down there as the noon and the 6 o'clock news anchor. Didn't know anything about television, but I'd spent time in radio and in television, sometime in television news. And so I did that for a year, got hired by KFDX down in Wichita Falls, Texas. Spent only 4 months there because the station, the ABC affiliate in Phoenix, Arizona, called and asked me to come out there. And I spent about a year and a half in Phoenix, co-anchoring the 6 and 10 o'clock news in Phoenix, which was the 23rd market in the nation at that time. So that was a great opportunity for me. But I always wanted to get back to Channel 4. That's where my family was, where my home was. I had the opportunity to come back to 4. That was when Jerry Adams left, so I was basically Jerry Adams' replacement. Jack Ogle was doing the 6. Ernie Schultz, of course, news director, was doing the noon show. And George Tomic was doing the 10. And then I came back as the weekend 6 and 10 anchor. And that was 1973, about February, as I recall. And we had some great people ultimately working on weekends up there. We had, of course, in addition to those that I've mentioned, we had, well, he wasn't working weekends, but Bob Dodson, Charlie Hoff, Daryl Barton, Oliver Murray, Pam Henry was working weekends with me, and Steve Newman, Weldon Watson, Dick Nelson. There were some great folks that came in on the weekends and helped out. But and then I was thinking about some of the directors that directed the newscasts when I was there. Billy Nix would do a number of them, but the one we mainly had was Mike Simmons, and Mike Simmons was a temperamental individual, but he was a great director, and we always got things on the air, which was amazing back in those days. Zoli Vajda also was a director back in those times that helped us get things on the air. Now, for those that are relatively new to the television industry, I'm going to remind everybody that back then we collected the news certainly on film. We used an old Bell & Howell 16 millimeter wind-up camera that was anything but quiet, and you would go into a somewhat tense setting, and everybody knew when you were filming because it made this fluttering kind of noise, and you could hear it everywhere. You had a choice of 3 lenses that rotated on the front of the camera, and shot, of course, just regular 16 millimeter silent film. We had the big hulking cameras with the Mickey Mouse ear film canisters on top that we started shooting our sound film with. Ultimately got to a CP16 film camera that was much more efficient, lightweight, and really was so very compact, and that worked out well, but still film. And so we had to take the film back to the studio, run it through a processor, and sometimes we wouldn't make that that well. The film would break in the processor or something. We might lose an entire story because the film broke in the processor. Of course, the guy that ran the film processor full time and kept it up to speed was Ray Summers, and he was phenomenal in keeping that thing going because there was so many working parts and so many tanks of this chemical and that chemical, and of course he taught us how to put the film in and get it out. And we would do our best, but sometimes we would end up losing a story because the film broke in the processor or something. But it wasn't as easy as it is today to come back and simply slap a tape in the machine and start editing. And when we did edit, we would have to use a little machine that scraped the emulsion off the back of the film. Then we'd have a glue pot. We would glue the film together and have a heated seam on it that would glue the pieces together. And if we got all that done, it took a lot of time. If we got it all done, and if a splice didn't break, then the story would be on the air as we had wanted it. But it was a little more difficult than the digital format and the age that we live in today. On the weekend shows, and again, I think this is quite a bit different than is done today, but the news anchor was the producer of the show. Every time there was a show, the news anchor was in charge of producing the show. Of course, they would consult with the weather guys and the sports guys as to how much time they needed, but they actually built the show and were responsible for getting it on and off the air at the appropriate times. Ron Turner helped us a lot with trying to keep things properly documented and formatted, and he was there a great deal of the time to help. But on the weekends, the people that typically did the shows on the weekends when I was there I was the newscaster. Worked with weathermen anywhere from Jim Williams, who would occasionally come in and do a weekend show, Mike Smith, who ultimately I think went on back to Kansas and worked with the Kansas State Network up there. John Anders was a weatherman, and Larry Brown was another weatherman that worked weekends quite a bit with us. The sports guys were, of course, there was Ron Thulin, who is still doing broadcast today for the NBA. Sports guys that were there primarily when I was working, of course, Robbie Robertson did, I think, most of the shows that during that period of time I was there. But we also had Bob Berry and Mike Treps and John Brooks. I was going to talk about the fact that I filled in. I was the weekend guy, often was the fill-in guy as well. So if Jack had to be gone or George Tomic had to be gone, typically, and they couldn't cover for each other, then I was asked to fill in for those shows. So I did a number of 6 and 10 o'clock shows during the week as well as the weekend shows. And there's one time in particular that I remember that George Tomic swung one of these cruise deals where he and Marianne hosted a cruise to go to Europe or something. And he was going to be gone for 3 weeks. And so I did the 10 o'clock shows for my weekend leading into his 3 weeks. I did all of his shows, all of my shows, and then I did my 2 shows the weekend coming out of his 3 weeks. And so I think I still hold the record for the consecutive number of 10 o'clock shows at Channel 4 at 23 in a row. 23 nights in a row I did the 10 o'clock show at Channel 4 when George was gone. I think something happened while I was there that was fairly rare in that we had a prison riot down at the state penitentiary in McAlister. And we, of course, learned about that. It was on a Saturday, which means we were, of course, I was there, regular schedule. And we sent reporters and we were doing audio feeds and all kinds. But I think we went live in the studio and stayed on the air live for 4 or 5 hours straight, just getting reports in, finally getting reports from our reporters that had driven to McAlister. So that's the only time I recall us doing that during my stretch. And certainly since it happened on a weekend, that was familiar to me because I think we were live in the studio for at least a good 4 or 5 hours covering the prison riot. Something else that happened on weekends fairly often, Ernie Schultz owned an airplane, and Ernie loved to fly. And on occasion, Ernie would find out there was going to be a parade or something that he wanted to attend in his hometown back up in the Shattuck, Oklahoma area. So he would take a camera and he would fly off to Shattuck and cover the story. And then on his way back, Teddy had made him a drop bag that he would put the film in, and it had a big red streamer on it, and it had all kinds of foam in it. And he would put those cans of film in the drop bag, and he would radio us that he was approaching the station. And at one time, there was actually a landing strip immediately to the east of the station, and planes could come in and land and take off. But with all those towers and guy wires and things out there, I don't think it was really a smart thing to do. But Ernie would fly by, and we would run out to that landing strip, that big grassy area, and he would push that drop bag out the window of the plane, and it would fall, and we would go pick it up and run inside, and process the film, and then put the story on the air that night. But it's the only time I'm aware of a station that I've been at where the news director would cover a story, drop it out of a plane, and we would put it on the air. When I started work at the station, we were doing 4 10-hour days. We would work a 10-hour schedule 4 days a week. And so my schedule was Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, since I was a weekend anchor. And during the week, I would cover things like the Oklahoma Legislature, and I would cover other just regular news stories. On the weekends, of course, I had my other duties. But that left me Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday free. And I had always talked about going to law school, hoping to use that to supplement my reporting career. And so I applied and was accepted to the Oklahoma City University Law School at nights. And the only night that I had a conflict was Friday night, because they didn't have class on Thursday. So I went Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and I talked to Ernie about it, and Ernie was gracious and said I could leave as soon as my story on Friday was packaged and ready to go, so because the classes started at 6 o'clock. And so that one night I had a conflict. But otherwise, I went to law school while I was working at Channel 4 and graduated in spring of '76 and continued working at Channel 4 until such time as George Atomic went to the 6 o'clock. And then they asked me to go to the 10 o'clock shows throughout the week. And having a family at home, young family, and I'd done that shift out in Arizona. Really wasn't too excited about. I'm a morning person, didn't want to do 10 o'clocks every night. So I decided at that point it was time for me to go practice law. So I opened a law practice in Edmond and left Channel 4. But I left a lot of fond memories and a lot of great people behind me at that time. One of the stories I did get to cover in '76, though, was the 1976 Republican National Convention in Kansas City. That was the convention that Ronald Reagan was challenging Gerald Ford, who had been succeeded to the presidency after Richard Nixon's resignation and the disqualification of Spiro Agnew. So Ford was president. Reagan was California governor and came in and was challenging Ford, and Ford actually got the nomination and then was defeated by Jimmy Carter. But it was a great convention to cover. The way we did it was we had a photographer and myself there at the convention, and we would shoot interviews in the mornings, and then we would take the film out to the airport in Kansas City, fly it back to Oklahoma City. It would be picked up at the airport in Oklahoma City, processed. I would write a story, phone in basically the script, and somebody would edit the film, and we would run the story then that evening on the evening news with a local twist to the national convention, which was, again, a very good opportunity for us. One of the things I remember too is the election coverage, of course, that we had back then. It was pretty primitive with, you didn't have a lot of electronic things you could pop up on the screen other than your regular Chiron or you could use a chroma key or something. But, I think things were pretty basic with a news desk and people feeding information to you, with this just in type comments regarding the numbers being called in from the county election board. But obviously the election was something that was most important to Oklahomans, and Channel 4 was right there in the middle of it, of course, when they occurred. Something else that was very prominent, as if you've been around the state much at all, you'll know, is the weather coverage. And I recall on weekends, weather was certainly a big part of what we had in the spring. I recall several times we covered tornadoes. I remember going to Tulsa with Daryl Barton one time that an F5 actually had a housing addition up in the Tulsa area, and basically there was nothing left but the slabs of concrete in that addition. And I don't recall any deaths or anything, but it was obviously a significant weather event. The other one that I remember so well is a tornado hit the town of Chickasha and did quite a bit of damage. And then not long after the tornado went through, it began to snow, and it left about 2 inches of snow on top of the damage from the tornado. And that happened to be a Sunday. And the NBC Nightly News program got wind of it. That being a very rare weather event, we had, of course, all the video, but we didn't have an opportunity to feed the program or any stories to NBC because of the programming that was being run at the time. And so I actually had the opportunity to get in the announce booth, and we did a live feed on the lead story of the NBC Nightly News that Sunday, being the tornado damage in Chickasha, Oklahoma. And so that was the only time I ever did a live feed for network news. But that was certainly a good memory. Speaking of weather, Jim Williams used to tell the story that he was on 4, of course, the consummate weatherman. Always drew those isobars all over the maps. None of us knew what they were, what they meant, but by golly, they looked professional. And he was on course against Gary England, and I think Fred Norman was over at Channel 5. And one thing that Jim and Fred used to talk about was during these tornado outbreaks, they really hated the fact that Gary would just stay on the air forever and ever and ever, talking about the watch zones and all of that stuff. So they never could get to go home. They were ready to go home. The storm was past, but Gary was still on the air, so they had to stay on the air. So very competitive market back then, and that really helped things out a lot. One of the other things I got to do, I think for the first time in Oklahoma City was, and I had done this out in Phoenix, but we had several high-profile trials, and because I was in law school, I was kind of a natural to go and cover the trials. So I had the opportunity to cover both the federal corruption trials of Governor David Hall and State Treasurer Leo Winters. And they don't allow cameras in the courtroom, and so I solicited the assistance of an artist, and I think his name was Steve Shockey. And he was a great artist, but he accompanied me every day of those trials, and we would go and cover the trials. Of course, David Hall was found guilty, and Leo Winters was found not guilty. And Senator Gene Stipe defended them both. So it was, again, great opportunities to do something new in television. Because Channel 4, I think, was the first one to use an artist's rendition of the events going on in a federal trial on the news that night. We all knew that Ernie Schultz was a straight shooter, and would be pretty conservative about what went on the air. We knew that. On the weekends, we loosened up a little bit, and we would get these feeds from the network of kind of funny stories. And I tried to, a lot of times we might not be able to fill a program, so a lot of times I would take one of those stories that the network had sent down, just a few seconds of a clip, and run it at the end of the show after the sports, and then I would make up a pun about that film. And so we did that, and I kept thinking, I'm going to get called on the carpet for this, because we would end the show kind of laughing, and I never did, and that was kind of the funny thing was. But I would hear from people all over town, hey, I saw the pun, I saw, that's a great way to end the show, and so maybe Ernie liked it as well. He never did say anything to me about it, didn't tell me to stop, so we kept doing it. And they were pretty bad. One example that I could think of is we had a film once about a guy that collected thermometers, and he was so proud of them. He had them in his basement, just racks and racks and racks of thermometers. And I thought, what kind of a pun could I make about that? Finally, we ended up with ending the show with the fact that the thermometers that were on the top of the rack, he had to have somebody help him with those because he was only Fahrenheit, and that's how bad they were. But we had fun doing them, and the public seemed to like them, so we didn't get told to stop. When I ultimately did leave Channel 4 in the fall of 1976, that was after I had passed the bar and I'd gotten licensed as an attorney, and decided to go ahead and open my law practice in Edmond, which I did for 30 plus years. The last show that I had, we brought on my replacement, who was Brad Edwards. Brad came in and took over the weekend news anchor, and he brought with him a book, and he said he wanted to present me this book. It was at the end of the show. We were introducing Brad, and he gave me this book, and it was entitled Ray's Best Jokes. And of course, he was quick to open it up and flip through the pages, and of course there was nothing in the book. It was all blank. And so ultimately the best joke was on me, the night that I left. Brad was a great guy. We all loved working with him, and he always, of course, kept us in stitches with his dry wit and the facial references he could make. But he was a good anchor. He ultimately ended up doing the In Your Corner segments and just made a real legacy for himself there at Channel 4. Of course, now everybody does those, but nobody does them like Brad did. And he was certainly a great individual that I enjoyed working with a long time. Working at Channel 4 was one of the greatest things that I think, the opportunities that I've ever had. It prepared me, of course, for doing a lot of other things, practicing law. Served in office now. I've been elected 10 separate times to public office in the Oklahoma State Legislature. I'm in my second term as Oklahoma County Commissioner and serve as chairman of the board of the Oklahoma County Commissioners. And so all of that background, I look back and think, that prepared me for dealing with the people and dealing with the issues, and of course dealing with them out in the open and making sure that everybody understood what's going on. And it's enlightening to me and satisfying to me to see how many people come out of the broadcast industry and continue their service to the public in either an elected office or perhaps in a public relations position as a spokesperson for a major entity in the state. And I think it speaks very well for the broadcast industry here in Oklahoma and Oklahoma City, that they produce quality people like that can come out and take those jobs and do a good job with them. I think the public is well served while they're at the stations, but they're also well served when they go on to other opportunities in their lives. And I thank Ernie Schultz, I thank Jack Ogle, George Tomic, all the individuals that I've mentioned for the time that we spent together at Channel 4. It was a great time. I'll never forget it.